Some of the most powerful cities in human history were never meant to be seen. They were carved inside mountains, buried under deserts, hidden in lava fields, and sealed beneath the ground. In this documentary, we uncover real ancient mysteries that survived where humans were never supposed to survive, underground fortresses, lost capitals above the clouds, and stone cities erased for thousands of years. These are not myths. These are not theories. These are the places the Earth tried to keep hidden. Watch till the end, and subscribe now for 7 years of luck and forgotten worlds. The Cyclopean cliff city of Mesa Verde, USA, high in the sandstone canyons of the American Southwest, where sheer cliffs rise like natural fortresses and silence stretches across dry plateaus, an entire city once lived suspended inside vertical rock walls. This place is now called Mesa Verde, and it preserves one of the most improbable forms of human habitation ever built in North America. Mesa Verde is not a single village. It is a network of hundreds of cliff dwellings carved into alcoves high above canyon floors, built by the ancestral Puebloans between roughly 600 and 1300 CE. These were not temporary shelters. They were fully planned stone cities with homes, storage rooms, ceremonial chambers, and defensive access routes, all embedded into vertical sandstone walls. From the canyon floor, many of these dwellings are almost invisible. From above, they vanish into shadowed recesses beneath overhanging cliffs. The builders chose this extreme position deliberately. It offered protection from enemies, shelter from harsh weather, and strategic control over movement through the canyons below. The most famous of these cities is Cliff Palace, consisting of more than 150 rooms and over 20 ceremonial kivas. The entire structure was built using sandstone blocks shaped by hand, stacked with remarkable precision using mud mortar. Wooden beams made from juniper and pinyon pine were hauled up the cliffs and set into stone walls to support roofs and upper levels. There were no pack animals, no metal tools, no wheels. Everything that created this cliff city was carried up by human hands. The ancestral Puebloans who built Mesa Verde were farmers who cultivated corn, beans, and squash on the mesa tops above the canyons. On the surface, life followed seasonal cycles of planting and harvest, but their homes were not on the surface anymore. They chose to live inside the cliffs. The reason for this shift remains one of the central mysteries of Mesa Verde. Earlier communities lived in pit houses and open villages on the plateau. Then, during the late 1100s, large populations relocated into the canyon walls almost simultaneously. Something changed their relationship with the land. One factor was climate. Evidence shows that this period saw extended drought across the region. With water becoming less reliable, people needed greater protection for their stored food. Cliff dwellings offered stable temperature, reduced evaporation, and defensible positions over canyon springs. Another factor was conflict. Archaeological evidence reveals signs of growing violence during this period. Defensive positioning became essential. Cliff dwellings could only be accessed by narrow hand and toe routes, retractable ladders, or steep stone stairways carved into rock. An attacking force would be exposed the entire way. Mesa Verde was not built to impress outsiders. It was built to survive. Inside these cliff cities, daily life continued with remarkable organisation. Families cooked over hearths, ground corn into meal, repaired tools, and stored crops in sealed rooms. Smoke escaped through small ceiling vents. Light entered through narrow doorways and openings cut into outer walls. The alcove acted like a sound shell, amplifying voices and protecting inner chambers from extremes of heat and cold. At the spiritual centre of each settlement were the kivas, circular underground ceremonial rooms accessed by ladder through the roof. These spaces were used for ritual, decision-making, and social structure. Even within a cliff face, spiritual life remained central. Water was collected from seeps that naturally formed along the canyon walls. These springs were reliable even during drought. Rainwater was also harvested from runoff above. Every drop mattered. Engineering here was subtle rather than monumental. Mesa Verde represents something rare in human history. It shows a culture that did not respond to environmental pressure by building outward, but by building inward into the land itself. At its peak, this region supported thousands of people living across hundreds of cliff dwellings. Yet around the end of the 13th century they all left. The abandonment of Mesa Verde was nearly total. Entire stone cities were left behind with pottery still in place, grinding stones abandoned, tools left where they last fell. Whatever forced this migration happened quickly enough that people did not return. Archaeologists believe the causes included a severe multi-decade drought combined with social pressure from overpopulation and conflict. Resources were stretched, Farmland was exhausted. Water sources declined. The land had reached its limit. Rather than collapse violently, the people moved. They migrated south into what is now Arizona and New Mexico, where their descendants still live among the Hopi, Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples. To these communities, Mesa Verde is not a mysterious ruin, it is an ancestral homeland. What makes Mesa Verde extraordinary is not only that it was built, but that it worked. For more than 150 years, thousands of people lived suspended inside a cliff wall with limited water, limited farmland, and almost no margin for error. Yet the city functioned. Children were born, crops were grown, ceremonies continued. The system held. Modern visitors often describe vertigo when standing at the edge of these dwellings. The heights feel impossible, but for the builders, this environment became normal. Stone stairways replaced streets, ladders replaced doorways, the cliff itself became both home and shield. Mesa Verde forces a fundamental question about civilization. Does a city need streets, towers, and open squares to function, or can it exist entirely inside the skin of a mountain? Here, the answer is carved into sandstone. The Cyclopean cliff city of Mesa Verde is not a monument to dominance over nature. It is a monument to adaptation. It shows what human communities can do when survival, belief, engineering, and environment are forced into perfect balance. And when the balance finally failed, the people did not vanish. They moved. They carried the story with them, and the cliff cities were left behind, holding their absence in stone. The Ice Age mammoth megastructure of Kostenki, Russia, along the frozen banks of the Don River in the open plains of what is now modern Russia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of homes unlike anything else in human history. These were not built from wood, brick, or stone. They were built entirely from the bones of mammoths. The site is known as Kostenki, and it preserves one of the most extreme survival environments ever recorded. Kostenki lies in a region that during the last ice age was not forest or farmland, but open steppe tundra. Winters were long. Temperatures dropped far below freezing for most of the year. Trees were scarce. Thick ice covered the ground seasonally. And yet, humans lived here continuously for tens of thousands of years. They did not just survive, they built architecture. Beginning roughly 45,000 years ago and continuing for thousands of years, multiple cultures inhabited this region. Among the most astonishing discoveries are circular dwellings made from hundreds of mammoth bones arranged into walls, foundations, and roof supports. Some structures measure more than 12 metres wide and contain the remains of dozens of animals in a single building. These were not random piles of bones, they were engineered shelters. Mammoth skulls formed the outer wall bases. Tusks were embedded vertically like pillars. Long limb bones were stacked horizontally to create wind-blocking barriers. Smaller bones filled gaps between structural pieces. Over this framework, skins were stretched and weighted with additional bones to form insulated roofs. In a world without wood, mammoths became architecture. The Ice Age people of Kostenki hunted mammoths not only for food but for survival material. Fat provided fuel for fire, meat provided nutrition, bones became shelter. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be replaced easily. Inside these mammoth houses, archaeologists have found hearths at their centres, surrounded by ash layers many metres thick, built up over centuries of repeated occupation. These fires burned day and night through brutal winters. Without constant heat, survival would have been impossible. Stone tools, ivory carvings, spear points, needles, beads, pigments, and figurines have all been recovered from within these structures. This means these were not temporary hunting camps. They were long-term homes where families lived, worked, stitched clothing, shared food, taught children, and buried their dead. One of the most important discoveries at Kostenki is the clear evidence of planning. Mammoth houses were not built randomly. They were arranged in organised clusters. Storage pits were dug nearby. Firewood and fat reserves were stored systematically. Activity zones were repeated across multiple structures. This is not the behaviour of scattered nomads. This is the behaviour of structured Ice Age communities. The environment forced this organisation. During winter months, temperatures likely fell below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Wind across open tundra made exposure deadly within minutes. Snow buried the ground. Rivers froze solid. Food migration patterns became unpredictable. And yet, human occupation did not falter. The mammoth bone houses functioned as insulated shells. Animal fat burned with intense heat. The thick hide coverings trapped warmth. Snow piled outside the walls and added further insulation. Smoke escaped through roof gaps. Inside, the temperature would have hovered just above freezing or slightly warmer, enough to survive while wrapped in layered animal skins. The most stunning aspect of Kostenki is not that humans survived this environment, but that they improved it. Over generations, building techniques became more refined, fire control improved, tool shapes became standardized, clothing production advanced, archaeological layers show repeated rebuilding at the same spots, meaning families return to the exact same house sites generation after generation. This creates one of the earliest known examples of long-term settlement continuity under extreme climatic conditions. Kostenki also preserves some of the oldest known evidence of modern human presence in northern Eurasia. This region was populated far earlier than once believed possible. The dark-skinned hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe moved north into frozen regions far sooner than older models predicted. Here, human expansion did not wait for comfort, it pushed directly into the cold. Genetic evidence from nearby burials reveals that the people of Kostenki were not isolated primitives. They were part of a wider network of early modern humans spreading across Eurasia. Trade in stone materials occurred across long distances. Pigments and decorative objects moved between groups. Even in the coldest phases of the Ice Age, social networks did not collapse. One of the most haunting discoveries at Kostenki is the scale of mammoth utilization. Some dwellings contain the bones of more than 60 animals. This raises important questions. Were these animals hunted in single massive events, or were bones collected gradually from natural carcasses across years? Most evidence suggests these structures were built slowly from accumulated kills and scavenged remains rather than from single catastrophic hunts. Over time, bones were cached, transported, and reused. This indicates long-range planning at a level rarely attributed to people of this era. The mammoth houses also served defensive and social functions. Their circular design created shared interior space that fostered cooperation. Firelight illuminated faces. Sound carried differently inside bone walls. Conversations, tool making, and storytelling happened in tight proximity. In this environment, survival was collective, not individual. Perhaps the most important lesson of Kostenki is that intelligence does not require monuments. It requires systems. These people did not build pyramids. They built life support bubbles out of the bones of the animals that fed them. When climate conditions shifted and the Ice Age began to retreat, mammoth populations declined. Forests began to expand. Wood became available again. The bone architecture tradition slowly disappeared as new environmental materials replaced it. But for thousands of years before trees returned, mammoth bone houses were among the most advanced shelters on Earth. They were adaptive architecture. They were survival machines. They were homes. The Ice Age mammoth megastructure of Kostenki forces a fundamental question. What does civilization really require? Stone buildings, agriculture, cities, or only the ability to organize, plan, share heat, share food, and reshape available material to survive another winter? At Kostenki, the answer is carved into bone. These people did not wait for nature to become friendly. They made it livable, and in the frozen darkness of ancient Russia, surrounded by snow, wind, and hunting paths carved into ice, they built entire villages from the skeletons of giants. The Lost Canyon, cities of Petra's backside, Jordan. When most of the world thinks of Petra, they imagine a single facade revealed through a narrow canyon, tourists emerging suddenly into a stone cathedral carved into pink sandstone. What almost no one sees is that this famous entrance represents only a fraction of a much larger hidden world. Beyond the treasury, and far from the crowded central path, lies a vast network of canyon cities, temples, homes, ritual centres, and infrastructure that once supported a true desert empire. This forgotten landscape is what can be called Petra's backside. Petra was not created as a monument for visitors. It was the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, a trading power that controlled caravan routes linking Arabia, the Levant, Egypt, and the Mediterranean world between roughly the 4th century BCE and the 2nd century CE. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, textiles, copper, silver, and exotic goods flowed through Petra's canyons. The wealth of this city was not produced locally, it was captured by location. The front of Petra shows only the ceremonial face of that system. The backside reveals how the city actually lived. Behind the main tourist corridor, vast residential districts extend deep into branching wadis and cliff walls. Entire neighbourhoods were carved into stone, with multi-room houses, water cisterns, stairways, storage vaults, courtyards, and workshops hidden along canyon shelves. These were not elite tombs. These were ordinary homes for families who worked in caravan logistics, water management, stone carving, animal handling, metalwork, and administration. One of the first hidden zones reached by the back routes is known today as Little Petra, or Sik al-Barid. Unlike the monumental core of Petra, Little Petra functioned as a trade staging town where caravans rested before entering the main city. Here, merchants lodged, animals were watered, cargo was reorganised, and contracts were likely negotiated before moving deeper into Petra's controlled commercial heart. The buildings of Little Petra are carved into low cliffs and arranged along narrow passageways that mirror the main Sik, but on a smaller scale. Painted dining chambers, storage niches, and open courtyards reveal that this area also hosted ritual banquets linked to trade guilds and elite sponsors. From there, the back routes rise sharply into the cliffs, reaching remote plateaus where few tourists ever go. Along these paths lie hundreds of unmarked doorways carved into vertical rock faces. Many lead to domestic complexes now empty, except for wind and sand. Some still contain plaster fragments, fireplace remains, and water channels cut directly through floors and walls. Water is the key to understanding how these canyon cities functioned at all. The Nabateans mastered hydraulic engineering at a level far beyond what their desert environment should have allowed. Rainfall in southern Jordan is minimal and unpredictable. Without control, flash floods destroy everything. With control, those same floods become life. Across Petra's backside, a vast system of hidden channels, ceramic pipes, dams, settling basins, pressure valves, and underground cisterns transform brief rainfall into year-round water security. Entire neighbourhoods were supplied through gravity-fed systems carved invisibly into canyon walls. Even secluded cliff districts miles from the city centre had reliable water access. This infrastructure explains how such a massive urban population could survive in a landscape that appears empty and hostile today. Beyond the residential zones lie ceremonial high places, accessible only by steep staircases carved directly into bedrock. One of the most important is the High Place of Sacrifice, a summit sanctuary overlooking the entire valley. From here, priests once conducted rituals tied to the sky, seasonal cycles, and the protection of the trade routes below. Stone altars, drainage channels for sacrificial fluids, and viewing platforms still remain. From this high ground, the full scale of the canyon city becomes visible. Dozens of separate neighbourhoods spread across hidden basins, ridges, and branching wadis. No single wall connects them. The mountain is the wall. Moving deeper along the backside trails leads into the secluded valley of Wadi Farasa, one of the most concentrated yet least visited ceremonial districts of Petra. Here stand the remains of multi-level temples, garden courtyards, water pavilions, and elite residences arranged along a narrow green corridor once fed by controlled springs. Unlike the monumental tomb facades on the main route, the architecture here shows daily life at work. Door thresholds are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Wall niches reveal lamp placement. Drainage grooves show where water once flowed continuously across floors to irrigate gardens and cool interior air. This was not a necropolis. It was a living district. Even farther into the back canyons, isolated villas appear, carved into cliffs overlooking empty valleys where no modern roads exist. These were likely estates of powerful Nabatean families who controlled sections of the caravan economy. Their homes combined isolation with absolute water security and visual command over approaches. The disappearance of these canyon cities followed the same pattern as Petra's better-known monuments. When Roman annexation arrived in 106 CE under Trajan, Petra was absorbed into the provincial system of the empire. Trade routes began to shift from overland caravans to sea-based shipping through the Red Sea and Mediterranean. The economic heart that sustained Petra quietly weakened. Then came earthquakes. Multiple major seismic events in the 4th and 6th centuries shattered water systems, collapsed cliff faces, and destroyed the carefully balanced hydraulic networks. A city built entirely on water precision could not survive water failure. Neighbourhood by neighbourhood, Petra emptied. The hidden canyon cities were abandoned not in war, but in silence. For centuries, Bedouin tribes used some of the deeper caves for seasonal shelter, but the organised urban life never returned. Unlike surface cities that attract rebuilding, Petra's backside required technical knowledge to function. Once that knowledge shattered, the mountains reclaimed their interior. What makes these lost canyon cities difficult to understand today is that modern visitors see them without sound, without firelight, without flowing water, and without the mass movement of people that once filled these spaces. Emotionally, they feel empty. Structurally, they are anything but. They are complete urban systems frozen in stone. Petra's backside also reveals something critical about how Nabatean power operated. The famous treasury and monastery were not isolated spectacles. They were ceremonial masks fronting an enormous hidden operational city. Administration, logistics, storage, housing, ritual, and water control all took place away from the theatrical entrance zone. This separation between symbolic front and functional backside is rare in ancient cities and explains why Petra's true scale was so long underestimated. Modern satellite mapping continues to reveal undocumented structures across the wider Petra basin. New stairways, cisterns, and platforms are still being recorded beyond the known tourist network. What is officially mapped today likely represents only part of what once existed. Petra was not one city, it was a distributed canyon civilization. The lost canyon cities of Petra's backside do not astonish with a single facade. They astonish with endurance, planning, and invisibility. Thousands of people once lived in zones that modern visitors walk through in silence without realizing they are crossing entire invisible neighborhoods. Here, architecture was not meant to dominate the skyline. It was meant to disappear into mountain walls. And when the trade stopped, the water failed and the routes shifted. The people did not leave behind ruins shaped for display. They left behind a city that only reveals itself to those willing to walk beyond the obvious. The rock city of Zelv, Turkey. In the heart of central Turkey, within a landscape shaped by fire, ash, and long vanished volcanoes, lies one of the most unusual urban experiments ever created by human hands. This place is known as Zelv, and it was not built on the land. It was carved directly into it. Zelv stands inside the wider region of Cappadocia, where millions of years ago, enormous eruptions laid down thick layers of ash and lava. Over time, wind and water sculpted this soft volcanic rock into cones, towers, and ridges now called fairy chimneys. To the eye, they look fragile, almost temporary. To human builders, they became walls, roofs, streets, and fortresses. Zelv was not a single cluster of caves. It was a full town system spread across 3 connected valleys, with homes, churches, tunnels, storage rooms, livestock shelters, vineyards, mills, kitchens, communal courtyards, and hiding chambers all carved into the same living rock. This city evolved slowly over more than 1,000 years, shaped by faith, invasion, climate, and survival. The earliest known occupation of Zelv dates back to the early Byzantine period, when Christian communities began carving shelters into cliff faces to escape persecution and later to isolate themselves from political chaos. Over time, these shelters expanded into permanent neighbourhoods. Rock that could be carved with simple tools became architecture. The cliffs became entire vertical villages. Every part of daily life in Zelv occurred inside stone. Families slept in rock bedrooms. Bread was baked in rock ovens. Grain was stored in rock silos. Livestock wintered in rock stables. Even grave niches were cut into canyon walls. Life, labour, worship, and death all happened inside the mountain. The churches of Zelv reveal one of its most important cultural layers. Dozens of chapels were carved directly into vertical rock faces and cones. Inside, walls were covered with frescoes painted in deep reds, browns, and blacks. Though many are now damaged by time and moisture, traces of saints, crosses, and geometric Christian symbolism still remain. These were not isolated hermit shrines. They were functioning parish centres for full communities. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, seasonal festivals, and daily prayers unfolded inside chambers where the only light entered through small window slits carved into volcanic stone. The choice to live inside rock was not only spiritual, it was strategic. Cappadocia sat at the crossroads of empires. Over the centuries, it faced Arab raids, Seljuk expansion, Mongol movement, and later Ottoman control. Surface villages were easy to burn. Rock cities were almost invisible. Zelva's most powerful defence was not its walls, it was its disappearance. From a distance, the valley looks empty. The entrances blend into natural erosion. Unless you know exactly where to look, you can walk past hundreds of doorways without ever recognising a town exists inside the cliff. Inside Zelv, long tunnel networks connect buildings across valley walls. Some tunnels are wide enough for animals, others force humans to crawl. Vertical escape shafts emerge far from visible entrances. In times of danger, populations could retreat deep into the rock and seal access points with rolling stone doors or wooden barriers. Food storage systems made long-term hiding possible. Grain silos were sealed. Wine was stored in cool underground chambers. Water was captured through rain channels, and small underground springs moving slowly through rock fissures. Life could continue without surface access for extended periods. Unlike the massive underground megacities elsewhere in Cappadocia, Zelv represents a hybrid system. It combined above-ground rock carving with medium-depth tunnel systems rather than vast subterranean labyrinths. This made it both visible and invisible at the same time. For centuries, Christians and later Muslims lived side by side in Zelva. Cave churches existed near mosques carved into the same valley walls. Cemeteries of different faiths overlapped. Shared wells served all families regardless of belief. This layered settlement reflects the slow religious transitions of Anatolia across medieval history. One of the most remarkable aspects of Zelva is how late it remained inhabited. Unlike most ancient rock cities that were abandoned in antiquity, Zelv supported permanent residents until the mid-20th century. Families were still living inside these caves in the 1950s. Children were born in rock rooms. Goat herds were kept in carved stables. Kitchens filled with smoke trapped against cave ceilings. Winters were survivable because the volcanic rock insulated against cold. Summers were bearable because the stone remained cool. Yet the same rock that protected life also carried danger. The Cappadocian tuffstone is soft. Over centuries, erosion weakens internal supports. Roof collapses became more frequent. Entire sections of villages fell without warning. By the 1950s, structural danger had reached a critical level. Fatal collapses forced the Turkish government to evacuate the remaining families and relocate them to a new surface village nearby. What had been a living rock city for nearly 1,000 years was suddenly abandoned. The departure was not a slow archaeological fade, it was a forced ending of daily life. Cooking fires went out, animal pens emptied, footpaths fell silent, and Zelv became a ruin in a matter of years. Today, visitors walking through the Zelv open-air museum see empty chambers, eroded stairways, collapsed ceilings, and exposed tunnels. Without voices and smoke, the caves feel larger. Without animals and storage vessels, rooms feel hollow. Yet the structure of a real town still remains clearly visible. Streets can be followed through narrow canyon gaps. Courtyards remain open where families once gathered. Water channels cut deep into rock still guide rain in the same direction they did centuries ago. Zelv also reveals something rare about long-term human adaptation. This city was not built in response to one crisis. It evolved across many. Each generation expanded or modified what the last had carved. New rooms were opened, old ones were sealed, churches were plastered over and repainted again and again as doctrines shifted. The city was not static, it was a living organism growing inside stone. Archaeologically, Zelv presents a challenge because everything is architecture. There is no clear division between artifact and environment. The mountain itself is the artifact. Every doorway, ledge, groove, stair, and chamber is intentional, yet formed from what appears at first glance to be natural erosion. This blurring between landscape and construction is what makes Cappadocia unique on Earth. Unlike cut-stone cities built from blocks, Zelv was sculpted out of negative space. The builders did not stack material, they removed it. This changes how time works in the city. In most ruins, weather slowly breaks down structures that were once added. In Zelv, weather slowly rebuilds what humans once removed. Doorways soften back into rock, sharp corners round into curves, tunnels blur into natural cavities. The city slowly returns to mountain. Zelv also reflects one of the most important truths about human architecture. The strongest structures are not always the hardest ones, they are often the ones that understand their material best. Soft rock allowed fast carving, it allowed repair, it allowed expansion without demolishing previous work, it allowed homes to grow with families rather than forcing families to relocate. People did not fight the mountain, they collaborated with it. The rock city of Zelve was not created by kings or empires, it was created by ordinary families across hundreds of years who solved problems one chamber at a time. When they needed more space, they carved it. When danger came, they tunneled deeper. When faith shifted, they reshaped chapels. When roofs weakened, they abandoned unstable rooms and carved safer ones nearby. Nothing here was imposed in a single moment. Everything was accumulated through use. Zelve shows what a city looks like when it is not planned from paper but from survival. And when survival was finally no longer possible inside collapsing stone, the people left not as conquerors or refugees, but as inheritors of a town that had simply reached the end of its geological lifespan. The rock city of Zelv does not dominate the horizon with walls or towers. It disappears into cliffs, it whispers through hollow chambers, and it reminds us that entire civilizations can exist inside mountains without leaving a single brick standing above the ground. The sacred mountain slabs of Nemrut Dağ, Turkey. High in the remote mountains of southeastern Turkey, where winter snow buries peaks for most of the year and the land feels closer to sky than earth, there is a summit where the heads of ancient gods sit scattered across broken stone platforms. This place is known as Nemrut Dar, and it holds one of the strangest royal monuments ever built in the ancient world. At more than 2,100 metres above sea level, the summit of Mount Nemrut is not an easy place to reach even today. In antiquity, bringing massive stone blocks and multi-ton statues to this height required years of organised labour, long supply chains, and absolute control over territory. The structure built here was not meant to serve a city or a population centre. It was built for a single man and his vision of eternity. That man was Antiochus Epiphanes of Commagene, a ruler of a small but strategically placed kingdom caught between the great powers of Rome and Parthia during the 1st century BCE. Antiochus ruled the kingdom of Commagene, a region that sat at the crossroads of Greek, Persian, Armenian, and Mesopotamian cultures. Instead of choosing one identity, Antiochus chose all of them. On the summit of Nemrut, he ordered the construction of a massive artificial stone mound known as a tumulus, built from millions of crushed limestone blocks piled more than 50 metres high. Beneath this mountain of stone, he intended to place his own sealed burial chamber, hidden so deeply that no future invader could ever reach it. That burial chamber, if it exists, has never been found. Surrounding the tumulus, Antiochus created a ring of monumental terraces filled with colossal seated statues. Each figure was carved from limestone blocks, stacked into bodies, standing nearly 9 metres tall. These were not ordinary gods. They were composite deities combining Greek and Persian religious traditions into a single ceremonial order. Among them sat statues identified as Zeus mixed with Ahura Mazda, Apollo merged with Mithra, Heracles combined with Ares, and the goddess of Commagene itself. Antiochus placed his own statue beside them, presenting himself not as a servant of the gods, but as their equal. Each statue once rose intact above the terraces, looking out over the vast plains below. But today, all that remains are their seated bodies and their massive stone heads, each weighing several tons, now lying broken and scattered across the ground, as if they were struck down in a single moment. The heads did not fall because of human attack. They fell because of time, earthquakes, frost expansion, and structural collapse. For nearly 2,000 years, seasonal temperature shifts cracked the stone from within. Tremors shook the slope. Wind and ice widened every fracture. Eventually, the neck joints failed, and the heads slid forward onto the summit floor where they still rest. Today, visitors walking among them stand at eye level with faces once meant to stare down entire kingdoms. The layout of Nemrut was not random. The statues were arranged on east and west terraces aligned precisely with the rising and setting sun. On certain days of the year, sunlight strikes specific figures at carefully chosen angles. This alignment suggests the site functioned as both a royal tomb sanctuary and a solar ritual platform. Antiochus did not merely want to be buried on a mountain. He wanted to merge his identity with the movement of the heavens. Long stone reliefs carved along the terraces show Antiochus shaking hands with the gods in scenes of divine legitimization. These images were meant to freeze his authority into eternal stone, declaring that his rule was sanctioned not by armies or birth alone, but by cosmic order itself. Inscriptions written in Greek across the site explain his intentions in remarkable detail. Antiochus openly states that he designed this monument so that future generations would honour his divine status and perform rituals to maintain his spirit among the gods. This makes Nemrut one of the most direct and unapologetic expressions of self-deification ever recorded in ancient history. Yet despite all of this effort, the kingdom of Commagene did not endure. Within a century of Antiochus's death, Roman power absorbed the region. The royal house vanished from history. The rituals stopped. The priests disappeared. The mountain shrine fell silent. Gradually, snow buried the terraces each winter. Winds scoured carvings bare. Earthquakes reshaped the summit. Antiochus's divine pretension faded back into abandoned stone. For centuries, Nemrut slipped into obscurity. Local people knew the mountain only as a strange heap of broken rock. The meaning of the statues was forgotten. The name of Antiochus survived only in fragmented inscriptions half buried in rubble. It was not until 1881 that the site was formally documented by German engineer Karl Sester while surveying roads for the Ottoman government. What he found shocked the academic world. An entire mountain sanctuary of colossal gods had survived nearly untouched at the roof of Anatolia. Since then, archaeologists from around the world have attempted to locate the hidden burial chamber beneath the tumulus. Advanced geophysical surveys have mapped internal anomalies. Narrow tunnels have been drilled, robotic probes have been tested, No confirmed tomb has ever been reached. If Antiochus's chamber still exists beneath the crushed stone, it remains one of the most unreachable royal burials on earth. What makes Nemrut unique is not just its scale or its statues, but its purpose. Unlike temples built for cities or pilgrimages, Nemrut was built almost purely for symbolic eternity. It was a message carved into the sky that declared one man's attempt to become immortal through stone and alignment with the cosmos. And yet, standing among the fallen heads today, that ambition feels fragile. The gods remain. Their bodies still sit on their thrones, but the heads that once gazed across kingdoms now lie tumbled at human height, weathered, cracked, and surrounded by silence. This is the real lesson of Nemrut Da. Power can move mountains. Time can still move power. The sacred mountain slabs of Nemrut Da do not tell the story of gods ruling the earth. They tell the story of a human king who tried to rule eternity, and on a frozen summit where wind never stops and snow returns every year, the stone faces of his divine court wait in quiet fragments for a world that moved on without them. The sunken Roman megaport of Portus, Italy. A few kilometres west of modern Rome, beyond the busy highways and apartment blocks, there is a stretch of quiet, flat land where fields, canals, and abandoned runways give almost no hint that one of the largest ports ever built in the ancient world lies buried just beneath the surface. This place is known as Portus, and for centuries it functioned as the maritime heart of the Roman Empire. Portus was not Rome's first harbour. For most of the early Roman Republic, ships used the river port at Ostia and smaller natural anchorages along the coast. But as Rome expanded into a global empire, controlling grain from Egypt, oil from North Africa, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, and luxury goods from the East, the old systems could no longer keep up. The Mediterranean was becoming Rome's internal highway, and Rome needed a purpose-built sea gate large enough to absorb the freight of an empire. That need gave birth to Portus. The first major construction phase began under Claudius in the mid-1st century CE. Claudius ordered the creation of an enormous artificial harbour north of Ostia, carved out of open coastline rather than a natural bay. Two massive curved breakwaters were built extending far into the sea, forming a protective basin large enough to hold hundreds of ships at once. At its centre, an artificial island was anchored to support a lighthouse that guided vessels safely through storms and darkness. This alone was one of the largest maritime engineering projects attempted in antiquity, but the harbour of Claudius suffered from silting, storm damage, and unpredictable currents. Within a century, a second and even more ambitious phase was added under the reign of Trajan. Trajan expanded Portus inland with a perfectly geometric hexagonal basin, still clearly visible today from the air. Each side of the hexagon measured over 350 metres. The basin connected to canals linking it with the Tiber River, Ostia, and the open sea, creating a fully controlled hydraulic transport network. This hexagonal harbour was not built for beauty. It was built for flow. Its shape minimised wave impact, reduced sediment build-up, and allowed ships to dock efficiently on all sides. Warehouses lined its edges in continuous blocks. Cranes, ramps, and loading platforms transformed Portus into an industrial transfer machine. At its peak, Portus handled millions of tons of cargo per year. Egypt alone shipped enough grain to feed over 1 million people in Rome annually. Amphorae filled with olive oil arrived from Hispania. Marble from Carrara and Greece moved through Portus before becoming temples, statues, and imperial monuments. Timber, metals, spices, glass, slaves, textiles, and animals all passed through this harbour. Every object that entered Rome first entered Portus. The site expanded into a complete administrative city. Beyond the docks and shipping basins rose warehouses taller than modern apartment buildings, customs offices, barracks for dock workers and naval crews, repair yards, rope-making facilities, and massive storage yards for bulk cargo. Roads, bridges, and canals interconnected everything into a coordinated logistics capital. The population of Portus included sailors, engineers, warehouse clerks, imperial administrators, labour gangs, soldiers, divers, carpenters, shipwrights, and local merchants. This was not a scenic harbour town, it was an industrial metropolis. Yet despite its scale, Portus was never meant to be a showcase city like Rome itself. It existed to serve Rome, and when Rome's needs changed, Portus vanished with almost no historical drama. As the Roman Empire weakened in the late 3rd and 4th centuries, trade volume declined. Grain shipments from Egypt were disrupted by political upheaval. Imperial patronage shrank. Maintenance of canals and breakwaters stopped. Storms damaged outer harbour defences. Sediment slowly choked the waterways. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Portus lost the economic system that kept it alive. Without constant dredging and repair, the sea reclaimed the coastline. Sandbars formed, river channels shifted, marshes expanded. Within a few centuries, the once greatest harbour on earth was no longer a port at all. It became dry land. What makes Portus different from other lost ancient cities is that it did not fall to invasion or fire or earthquake. It dissolved quietly into geography. Its stones were robbed for new construction in Rome and Ostia. Its canals became drainage ditches. Its basins became farmland. For over 1,000 years, no one fully understood what lay beneath these fields. The rediscovery of Portus did not begin with dramatic excavation, but with quiet technology. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, archaeologists began using satellite imagery, aerial photography, and ground-penetrating radar to scan the flatlands west of Rome. What appeared in the data astonished them. Beneath the soil lay the unmistakable geometry of Trajan's hexagon. Beneath nearby runways lay the massive breakwaters of Claudius's original outer harbour. From orbit, the ghost of Rome's sea gateway emerged. Excavations soon followed, revealing warehouses with intact floor mosaics, dock walls still bearing rope wear marks, mooring stones exactly where ships had once tied, and drainage systems still aligned as if the harbour might refill again with a single storm. One of the most remarkable discoveries was the scale of storage capacity. Entire districts of warehouses were devoted to specific commodities. Some floors still preserve stamp marks, identifying state-controlled grain shipments. Others reveal private merchant ownership through painted inventory labels. This means Portus was not a chaotic dockyard. It was a regulated economic machine with bookkeeping, taxation, inspection, and imperial oversight embedded in its architecture. Even more startling was the discovery of large ship basins used for repair and construction. These were not simple beach landings. They were controlled water docks with gates, lined with stone slipways, allowing hulls to be lifted, serviced, and returned to service with assembly line precision. The Romans did not merely sail the sea, they industrialised it. The reason Portus remained hidden for so long is that it did not leave behind towering ruins. It left behind smooth infrastructure designed to be flat. Once canals filled and basins dried, the land became ordinary ground. Farmers ploughed over imperial dockyards without realising it. Even parts of modern infrastructure were built unknowingly on top of Roman shipping lanes. Portus also reshapes our understanding of how Rome functioned as a megacity. Rome was not just a city of politics and monuments. It was a city entirely dependent on constant logistical lifelines. Without Portus, Rome starved. Without Portus, the empire fractured. Modern computer models of Roman supply chains now place Portus as one of the most critical economic nodes of the ancient world, rivaling even Alexandria and Antioch in logistical importance. Yet unlike those cities, Portus left almost no trace above ground. It became invisible. The sunken Roman megaport of Portus demonstrates one of the most important truths of ancient infrastructure. The most vital systems are often the least visible. Palaces impress crowds, ports feed empires, and when ports fail quietly, empires do not collapse instantly. They slow, they shrink, they fade. Today, when archaeologists walk the drained hexagon of Trajan's basin, they stand inside a space once filled with masts, sails, shouting crews, rolling cargo, splashing water, and the constant shock of ships docking against stone. Now there is only grass, shallow ponds, and wind, yet the geometry still holds. The ghost port still shapes the land. Rome no longer rules the sea, but the sea once ruled Rome through this place, and that place, buried in silence just beyond the modern city's edge, is Portus. The fortress city, inside a crater, Acoma, USA, in the high desert of what is now the southwestern United States, where red stone mesas rise abruptly from flat volcanic plains and the horizon stretches without interruption for miles, there exists a city that appears almost impossible at first sight. It sits on top of a sheer-sided rock pillar more than 110 metres above the surrounding land, with vertical cliffs on every side and only a few narrow access points carved into stone. This place is known as Acoma Pueblo, often called Sky City, and it is one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America. From a distance, Acoma does not look like a ruin or a fortress. It looks like part of the mesa itself. Adobe walls blend into sandstone. Flat roofs mirror the horizon. There are no trees for shade, no rivers flowing nearby, no obvious source of life in the surrounding desert. Yet people have lived here continuously for almost 1,000 years. The mesa on which Acoma stands is all that remains of an ancient volcanic crater. Lava once poured across this plateau and later eroded away, leaving behind a high isolated pillar of steel-hard rock surrounded by empty desert. Over time, the ancestors of the Acoma people climbed this mesa and chose it as their permanent home. The decision was not about comfort, it was about survival. From the summit, the entire surrounding valley can be seen for dozens of kilometres in every direction. Any approaching group would be visible hours before arrival. In a world of shifting tribal alliances, drought cycles, and periodic warfare, this height offered something no surface settlement ever could. Time. There was no natural road to the top. The earliest entrances were hand-cut steps carved directly into the rock face. Ladders could be lifted, narrow paths could be defended by a small number of people. No army could rush the summit without massive loss. Acoma was not simply a village, it was a stone sky fortress. The settlement grew slowly across centuries. Homes were built from adobe bricks moulded from clay, sand, and water carried up the mesa by human hands. Thick walls regulated interior temperature, trapping warmth in winter and keeping interiors cool in summer. Roofs were used as terraces, connected by ladders and stepways, creating a vertical living system rather than horizontal streets. There were no ground-level windows on many structures. Openings faced inward toward community spaces or outward, across cliffs where no intruder could reach them. Storage rooms held corn, beans, squash, dried meat, and water jars. Every household maintained reserves because drought was not a disaster. It was a certainty. Water was the greatest challenge. There were no springs on the mesa top. Every drop came from rainfall. Over generations, the Acoma developed a system of cisterns, clay-lined reservoirs, and storage vessels to capture and preserve limited rainwater. Access to water was strictly managed. Waste was carefully controlled to protect supply. This alone made long-term life on Acoma possible. The people who built Acoma belonged to the broader ancestral Pueblo world, but their mesa location made them unique. While many Pueblo cultures lived in canyon walls, valley villages, or open plateau towns, Acoma rose entirely into the sky. The fortress city stood at the intersection of key ancient trade routes. Shells from the Pacific Ocean, turquoise from deep inland mines, macaw feathers from Mesoamerica, and obsidian from distant volcanic fields all reached Acoma through vast trading networks. The city's extreme location never isolated it from commerce or communication. It protected it. Spiritually, Acoma life was organised around ritual cycles tied to rain, planting, harvest, and balance between human and natural forces. Kivas carved into stone and integrated into the settlement served as ceremonial chambers where spiritual leaders conducted seasonal rites that governed community life. These rituals were not private. They were collective survival mechanisms tied directly to rainfall and food security. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century transformed everything. In 1540, Spanish explorers reached Acoma while searching for legendary cities of gold. What they found instead was a stone fortress in the sky that could not be approached like a traditional town. Initial contact was tense but non-violent. That changed in 1599. Following the killing of several Spanish soldiers during a dispute, the Spanish launched a full assault on Acoma. Cannons were dragged across the plateau. Climbing forces assaulted the narrow access routes under fire. After days of brutal fighting, Spanish troops reached the summit. The result was one of the most devastating single events in Pueblo history. Hundreds of Acoma people were killed. Survivors were enslaved, maimed, or forcibly relocated. The city itself was burned and damaged, but it was never abandoned. The people returned. They rebuilt their sky city and adapted to Spanish colonial rule under enormous pressure. Catholic missions were enforced, indigenous ceremonies were suppressed, traditional governance systems were disrupted, yet Acoma endured. In the early 17th century, the massive mission church of San Esteban del Rey Mission was constructed directly on the mesa summit using adobe, sandstone, and wooden beams hauled up entirely by hand. Timber for the church roof was carried from mountain forest over 30 kilometres away, with no animals or wheeled carts. Every beam was lifted on human shoulders. The church walls are more than 3 metres thick. It still stands today. Through droughts, colonial rule, forced assimilation, disease outbreaks, and territorial loss, Acoma remained inhabited. While many indigenous settlements across the southwest were abandoned or relocated, Acoma never moved. Electricity reached the summit only in the 20th century. Running water arrived. Even later, until that time, families climbed ladders daily carrying water, supplies, and food exactly as their ancestors had done for centuries. Even today, many homes on the Mesa summit remain without modern plumbing. Residency is maintained by families who choose continuity over convenience. Archaeologically, Acoma is not frozen in one era. It is a living site layered with nearly 1,000 years of habitation. Under modern floors lie earlier structures. Beneath those lie still older Pueblo foundations. Each generation built directly upon the last without erasing it. This makes Acoma both a city and a continuous archaeological record. Unlike abandoned ruins that preserve a single moment in time, Acoma preserves change itself. It has survived drought cycles that emptied entire regions. It has survived direct military destruction. It has survived forced religious conversion. It has survived the long economic isolation of the high desert. It survives today because its people never surrendered their connection to the mesa. The fortress city. Inside a crater is not an exaggeration. Geologically, Acoma stands where a volcanic system once dominated the land. Culturally, it became a place where survival was engineered into architecture, access, water control, and collective memory. From below, the city does not look threatening. From above, the desert stretches endlessly. But from inside, Acoma is something rare in world history. It is not a ruin. It is not a reconstruction. It is not a museum. It is a living fortress that chose the sky as its ground. And after nearly 1,000 years it is still there. The stone spiral desert city of Rujm El Hiri, Israel. On a wind-swept volcanic plateau in the far northeast of Israel, where the land is covered in ancient black basalt and the horizon stretches without interruption in every direction, there exists one of the most quietly complex structures ever built in prehistoric times. A structure that reveals almost nothing of its true nature when viewed from the ground, but suddenly transforms into a massive geometric design when seen from the sky. A place now known as Rujm El Hiri, also called Gilgal Rephaim. To a person walking across the plateau, Rujm El Hiri first appears as nothing more than scattered low stone walls, rising unevenly from the dark volcanic soil, walls that seem too short to be defensive and too disorganised to be architectural in the conventional sense. Yet if one climbs a nearby ridge or views the site through aerial imaging, the scattered stones suddenly resolve into an enormous system of concentric circular rings forming a vast spiral-like geometry more than 150 metres across, a design so large that it can only be fully understood from above. The structure consists of 5 massive stone rings built from more than 40,000 tons of basalt rock, arranged around a central stone mound that rises like a low artificial hill at the core of the complex, with each ring broken at several controlled entrance points that form passageways between zones of the monument, all constructed without mortar, without inscriptions, without tools of metal, and without any surviving record of who designed it or why. Rujm El Hiri was built roughly around 3000 BCE during the early Bronze Age, long before the rise of the great kingdoms of the Levant, before written language dominated the region, and before large urban centres reshaped the landscape, which means the people who built it left no written explanation of its purpose, no royal names, no dedicatory plaques, and no historical memory tied to its creation that survived into later civilizations. The location itself makes the construction even more puzzling, because the Golan Heights is not fertile farmland, does not contain major river systems, and has always been a harsh environment shaped by ancient volcanic flows, earthquakes, and severe seasonal winds. Yet the builders of Rujm El Hiri selected this remote lava-covered plateau deliberately and committed themselves to reshaping it with one of the largest stone monuments of its time. Every block at the site is made of basalt, one of the hardest stones to work with using primitive tools, which means each individual stone had to be pried loose from the earth, shaped by hammering, dragged across uneven terrain, and carefully stacked into curved walls with precise alignment, maintained over hundreds of metres of circumference, an act that required massive coordinated labour across many years and possibly across multiple generations. From the ground, the rings appear incomplete, asymmetrical and confusing, yet from an elevated view they reveal near perfect circular geometry with deliberate proportional spacing between each ring, proving that the planners of this monument were working with large-scale spatial measurement and long-term observational logic rather than decorative artistry. At the heart of the monument rises a central cairn constructed from piled stone that originally stood much taller than it does today, and inside this mound, archaeologists discovered a built burial chamber containing human remains, which strongly suggests that ritual death, elite burial, and cosmic symbolism were directly linked within the overall design of the site. What transformed scholarly understanding of Rujm El Hiri was the discovery that the main eastern entrance of the outer ring aligns precisely with the sunrise of the summer solstice, meaning that on the longest day of the year, the sun rises in perfect alignment with the corridor leading directly toward the central cairn, a level of astronomical control that could only be achieved through long-term observation of solar movement across decades rather than accidental placement. Additional alignments within the inner rings correspond to equinox positions and seasonal transitions that would have been critical to early agricultural and pastoral societies for tracking rainfall, grazing cycles, migration patterns and ritual timing, which means that Rujm El Hiri functioned not simply as a static stone monument, but as a living calendrical machine that encoded time directly into architecture. Unlike Stonehenge, which expresses its astronomical purpose through towering vertical stones, Rujm El Hiri expresses its logic horizontally across an entire stretch of open land, turning the ground itself into a cosmic instrument whose movements can only be fully understood when sunlight crosses it at key moments of the year. One of the great mysteries of the site is that there is no evidence of permanent domestic occupation within the rings, no houses, no cooking hearths, no animal pens, no storage rooms, and no everyday debris that would indicate a resident population, which implies that people travelled to Rujm El Hiri at specific times rather than living beside it continuously. This strongly supports the interpretation that Rujm El Hiri served as a seasonal pilgrimage centre where scattered communities gathered at predetermined solar moments to perform ceremonies that synchronised social life with cosmic time, making it not a city of inhabitants, but a city of gatherings. The name Gilgal Rephaim, preserved in later Hebrew tradition, translates loosely as the Wheel of the Giants, a phrase that does not describe physical giants in a literal sense, but reflects how later cultures understood the superhuman scale of the builders, who were believed to have moved impossible stones in an age long before historical memory. For thousands of years after its construction, Rujm El Hiri remained visible yet functionally unreadable, sitting quietly in open grassland where shepherds walked past its walls without recognising their cosmic role, its significance preserved not by writing or ritual continuity, but by mythic echoes embedded in regional folklore. One of the most remarkable qualities of the site is that it survived precisely because it never appeared monumental from ground level, meaning that later empires had no incentive to dismantle it for building material, no motive to repurpose it as a palace foundation, and no practical use for its sprawling low stone geometry. In this way, invisibility became its protection. Modern satellite imagery finally revealed what ancient builders had encoded into the land, showing that the monument was not chaotic but mathematically deliberate, its curved paths guiding attention inward in a visual spiral that mirrors the motion of the sky itself, a symbolic integration of earth and heavens crafted without written numbers or mechanical surveying instruments. What makes this particularly strange is that the full geometry of Rujm El Hiri is easiest to perceive from an aerial vantage point that ancient builders never physically experienced in the modern sense, and yet through patient hilltop observation, rope pacing, horizon tracking, and generational correction, they succeeded in creating a structure whose full meaning emerges only when seen from above. This forces a shift in how intelligence is measured in prehistoric architecture, because the builders of Rujm El Hiri demonstrate not technological limitation, but conceptual ambition, an ability to think in scales far larger than individual lifespans, and to commit labour to a design whose completion extended beyond any one generation's lifetime. The stone spiral desert city of Rujm El Hiri was therefore not a project of a single ruler or tribe, but an intergenerational conversation with the sky, one that linked human movement on Earth with solar movement across the horizon through stone that would outlast every voice that placed it. Standing inside the rings today, surrounded by silent basalt walls that barely rise above the landscape, it is almost impossible to feel the monument's scale until one remembers that its true audience was not human height, but celestial movement, sunlight sliding through aligned corridors that come alive only on specific days of the year. This is why Rujm El Hiri still resists simple explanation, because it was never built to explain itself visually in ordinary time, only in sacred time, only when the sun reaches exact positions that unlock its geometry for brief moments before the land returns again to silence. It is not a ruin in the traditional sense. It is not a fortress. It is not a city of houses. It is a city of time, and for more than 5,000 years, long after the hands that placed its stones have turned to dust, the sky has continued to complete the design exactly as its builders once planned. The lost river city of Mohenjo-Daro, Pakistan. On the wide, flat floodplains of what is now southern Pakistan, where the waters of the Indus River once shifted across the land with seasonal force, there lies a silent city of brick, order, and forgotten engineering that once supported tens of thousands of people more than 4,500 years ago, a city now known as Mohenjo-Daro, meaning loosely, Mound of the Dead. Mohenjo-daro was not a village that slowly grew by accident, and it was not shaped by kings or dynasties whose names dominate history books, but instead it emerged as one of the great urban centres of the ancient Indus Valley civilization, a civilization that developed independently alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet followed a completely different path in how it shaped cities, power, and daily life. When archaeologists first uncovered Mohenjo-daro in the 1920s, they were stunned not by palaces or golden tombs, but by something far more unexpected for a Bronze Age city, which was perfect streets laid out in strict grid patterns, standardised baked bricks used everywhere, and a municipal drainage system so advanced that parts of it would not look out of place in a modern city today. The city was divided into two major zones, a raised western citadel and a larger lower town stretching across the floodplain, with both sections connected by wide streets that ran straight for hundreds of metres at right angles, forming one of the earliest known examples of large-scale urban planning based on logic rather than monumentality. Every major street in Mohenjo-daro was equipped with covered drainage channels built from carefully fitted bricks and sealed with stone or brick slabs, allowing wastewater from homes to flow underground rather than polluting the streets, and along these drains were regularly spaced inspection openings that allowed maintenance crews to clean blockages, proving that this was not a one-time construction but a managed urban system. What makes this system extraordinary is that nearly every house in Mohenjo-daro, from small one-room dwellings to large multi-courtyard residences, had direct access to private wells and indoor bathing areas, with water flowing from wells into bathing rooms and then exiting through the underground drainage network, which means that personal hygiene and sanitation were embedded into everyday life at a level that would not be seen again in most parts of the world for thousands of years. At the heart of the citadel stands the most famous structure of Mohenjo-daro, known today as the Great Bath, a rectangular water tank built from precisely laid bricks, sealed with bitumen for waterproofing, and surrounded by colonnaded rooms and changing platforms, a structure that was not designed for ordinary washing, but for ritual bathing tied to belief, purification, and social ceremony. The presence of the Great Bath tells us that water was not only a survival necessity, but a sacred element within the city's spiritual framework. Yet unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, Mohenjo-daro left behind no large temples to specific gods, no statues of divine rulers, and no massive royal tombs, which suggests that religious authority here was organised very differently. Power in Mohenjo-daro does not appear to have centred on a visible king class, because no palaces have been identified that dominate the cityscape, and elite houses differ from poorer ones mainly in size, not in symbolic display, which leads many scholars to believe that the Indus Valley civilization functioned through collective civic administration rather than centralised divine monarchy. This is further supported by the city's intense standardisation, because bricks across Mohenjo-daro follow identical proportions regardless of building size, public or private, rich or poor, and such uniformity requires regulation, shared codes, and civic planning enforced across the entire population. The economy of Mohenjo-daro was deeply connected to river trade, agriculture, and long-distance commerce, with crops such as wheat, barley, and cotton grown in the surrounding fields, livestock such as cattle and water buffalo raised for labour and food, and goods such as beads, metal tools, shell ornaments, and seals produced in specialised workshops inside the city. Seals found at Mohenjo-daro, carved with animals such as bulls, unicorn-like creatures, elephants, and tigers, along with short inscriptions in the still undeciphered Indus script, have been discovered as far away as Mesopotamia, proving that this river city was directly connected to international trade networks more than 4,000 years ago. Despite all this organisation, Mohenjo-daro was not built to last forever in its original location, because the Indus River is a living force that changes course over centuries, and geological evidence shows that Mohenjo-daro was repeatedly flooded and rebuilt on higher and higher platforms across its history. Archaeologists have identified multiple rebuilding phases where entire sections of the city were raised with packed earth and new brick layers after major floods, which means that the inhabitants of Mohenjo-daro understood that they were living in an unstable natural system, yet chose to remain and adapt, rather than abandon the site immediately. The repeated investment in rebuilding reveals a society that believed deeply in its city as an anchor point of identity, economy, and belief, even as the river that sustained it also threatened its existence. Then, sometime around 1900 BCE, something changed across the entire Indus Valley world, as Mohenjo-daro and many other major cities were gradually abandoned, not through signs of violent conquest, not through burning or massacre, but through silent withdrawal. There are no large battle destruction layers at Mohenjo-Daro, no mass graves, no collapsed defensive works that point to an invading army destroying the city, and instead the evidence suggests a long environmental and economic decline driven by shifting river patterns, repeated flooding, drought cycles, and breakdown of long-distance trade networks. As river branches dried or shifted away from major urban centres, agriculture became unstable, water supply could no longer be guaranteed, and the dense urban systems that depended on precise water control slowly unravelled. People did not vanish. They adapted by dispersing into smaller rural communities. Mohenjo-Daro emptied not in a single moment of catastrophe, but through generations of quiet departure. The city remained, brick by brick, while life moved elsewhere. What makes Mohenjo-Daro so powerful today is that it represents one of the highest achievements of early urban life, without relying on the visual language of kings, pyramids, or imperial domination, because here, civilization expressed itself through water management, sanitation, equality of materials, and collective order rather than through spectacle. It shows a version of ancient civilization where leadership was hidden inside systems rather than carved into monuments. Modern excavations continue to reveal just how advanced this hidden leadership was, with discoveries of flood control embankments, regulated street elevation, standardised weights for trade, and fine-tuned brick kilns that mass-produced identical building units at scale. Even today, engineers study Mohenjo-Daro's drainage slopes and well placements to understand how the ancient builders achieved consistent gravitational flow without modern measuring instruments, relying only on experience, repetition, and shared geometric logic. Standing in the ruins today, with the Indus floodplain stretching outward under a harsh sun and hot wind moving through exposed brick streets, it is difficult to imagine the city alive with movement, voices, water flowing in covered drains, traders crossing platforms, children bathing in neighbourhoods, and ritual processions passing toward the Great Bath. Yet the infrastructure remains as proof that this city was not theoretical. It functioned. It worked. It sustained tens of thousands of lives with precision. The lost river city of Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that advanced civilization is not defined by gold, conquest, or massive towers, but by whether people can live cleanly, safely, and collectively within a system of shared rules that places the survival of the whole above the power of the individual. 4,500 years later, the bricks still hold that lesson. The buried step pyramid of Edfu, Egypt. On the west bank of the Nile River, near the ancient city known today as Edfu, there rises a low, eroded mass of stone that for most of history looked like nothing more than a natural hill swallowed by desert sand. Yet hidden inside this mound is one of the oldest surviving pyramid structures in Egypt, a monument built centuries before the pyramids of Giza and nearly erased from memory by time, wind, and neglect. This structure is known as the Edfu Step Pyramid, one of a small group of early pyramids scattered across southern Egypt that predate the age of true royal pyramids and belong to a shadowy, experimental phase of pyramid construction that still remains poorly understood by archaeology. Unlike the famous pyramids built as tombs for divine kings, the Edfu pyramid does not appear to have been constructed for burial at all, and no burial chamber has ever been found inside it, which immediately sets it apart from the later, more familiar pyramid tradition and places it into a different category of ancient architecture whose purpose is still debated. The pyramid was built during the late 3rd dynasty or early 4th dynasty of Egypt, placing its construction around 2600 BCE or possibly slightly earlier, making it contemporary with or even older than the earliest phases of pyramid experimentation that later culminated in the Great Pyramid of Giza. Yet unlike Giza, which remained visible and monumental across all eras, the Edfu pyramid was steadily buried by drifting desert sand, encroaching settlements, stone robbing, and natural erosion until it faded entirely from public consciousness, surviving only as an oddly shaped hill on the edge of a growing town. For centuries, locals built homes against its sides, quarried its stone for construction, and buried debris against its base without realising they were living beside one of Egypt's oldest pyramids. It was not until the early 20th century that archaeologists recognised the artificial nature of the mound and began systematic investigation, gradually peeling away layers of sand, rubble, and later occupation to reveal the stepped core of a true pyramid hidden beneath. What emerged was a compact, steep-sided structure, originally composed of 3 step levels, rising to a height of about 13 metres, far smaller than the Great Pyramid, but massive enough to dominate the surrounding settlement landscape of ancient Edfu at the time of its construction. The pyramid was built entirely of rough local sandstone blocks stacked in horizontal courses without the fine casing stones seen in later pyramids, and its core shows that it was constructed rapidly rather than with the extreme precision associated with royal tomb monuments. There are no internal chambers, corridors, or burial spaces inside the pyramid, and this absence is one of the most important clues to its function, because it suggests that the Edfu pyramid was never intended to serve as a tomb for a king. Instead, many Egyptologists now interpret this structure as a symbolic or ceremonial pyramid, possibly associated with royal power projection, cult ritual, or administrative authority in Egypt's provincial regions rather than its capital. At the time of its construction, Egypt was undergoing rapid political consolidation under early dynastic rulers who were transforming small regional chiefdoms into a centralised kingdom ruled from the north, and in this process, architecture played a critical role in expressing that new unified authority. Rather than ruling only from a single capital, early kings appeared to have established symbolic markers of power across the territory, and the provincial step pyramids, including the one at Edfu, may have served as visible statements of centralised control in distant regions far from the royal court. This interpretation fits with the pattern that similar early step pyramids exist at several sites along the Nile Valley, all sharing comparable size, shape, and lack of burial chambers, suggesting that they were part of a coordinated, state-sponsored building programme rather than isolated local projects. The Edfu pyramid would have stood at the edge of the ancient settlement overlooking farmland, river traffic, and desert approaches, acting as both a monumental marker of authority and a focal point for ritual or administrative gatherings connected to the king's power. Its steep-stepped profile would have made it visible from far across the floodplain, sending a clear visual message that the king's presence extended even to this distant provincial frontier. Unlike later pyramids that focused heavily on funerary theology and the afterlife of the ruler, the Edfu pyramid appears to belong to a time when the pyramid form itself was still being defined conceptually as a symbol of state power before it became strictly associated with royal burial. This places the Edfu structure into a crucial experimental moment in Egyptian architecture, when builders were still testing how stone monuments could communicate ideology, authority, and cosmic order. Excavations around the pyramid have revealed traces of small chapels, offering installations and surrounding activity areas that indicate the site was used for ritual purposes rather than as a burial ground, reinforcing the idea that its importance lay in ceremony and governance rather than death. At some point, not long after its construction, the pyramid appears to have been intentionally abandoned and partially dismantled, possibly due to changes in religious practice, royal policy, or shifts in administrative organisation during the early 4th dynasty, after which attention moved toward the massive royal burial projects farther north. Once abandoned, the desert slowly reclaimed the structure as wind carried sand against its sides, and seasonal Nile floods deposited layers of silt around its base. As centuries passed, the pyramid sank into obscurity while the city of Edfu continued to grow and change around it, eventually becoming one of Egypt's major religious centres dedicated to the falcon god Horus, whose later monumental temple still dominates the region today. The contrast between the Edfu step pyramid and the later temple of Horus is striking, because while the temple remained revered and maintained across successive dynasties, the pyramid belonged to an earlier phase of religious and political development that no longer fit the evolving spiritual landscape of Egypt. By the time of the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, the pyramid had become little more than a forgotten mound on the outskirts of town, its meaning lost, even as new sacred architecture rose nearby. Modern archaeological excavation brought the Edfu pyramid back into historical consciousness, revealing not only its form, but its importance as evidence for how the idea of the pyramid evolved before it was perfected at sites like Saqqara and Giza. It demonstrates that pyramid construction in Egypt did not appear suddenly in its final perfected form, but rather grew through a series of regional experiments, symbolic monuments, and ideological trials spread across the Nile Valley. The Edfu pyramid also reminds us that many of the most important monuments of early civilization were not the largest or the most famous, but those that quietly shaped what later generations would refine and monumentalize on a far greater scale. The fact that such a structure could be almost completely erased by sand and human activity for thousands of years shows how fragile even stone monuments can be when history shifts its attention elsewhere. Today, only a partially restored core of the Edfu pyramid remains visible, its original sharp steps softened by erosion and time. Yet even in its worn state, it still preserves the unmistakable geometry of one of Egypt's earliest pyramid forms. Standing beside it now, dwarfed by nearby modern buildings and overshadowed by later temples, it is difficult to imagine how revolutionary this structure once must have seemed to the people who lived here in the early days of Egyptian statehood. The buried step pyramid of Edfu does not impress through size or grandeur, but through what it represents, which is the moment when Egyptian builders were first learning how to turn royal authority into permanent stone, long before pyramids became the iconic symbols of Egypt recognised around the world. It is a reminder that many of the most important steps in human history do not survive as perfect monuments, but as worn foundations hidden beneath layers of later civilization. And in the sands beside the Nile at Edfu, one of those hidden foundations still stands. The mountain ring city of Archaim, Russia. In the wide open grasslands of the southern Russia, near the eastern slopes of the Ural Mountains, there lies the faint circular outline of a city that once stood at the edge of the known world nearly 4,000 years ago, a place built with mathematical precision, defensive foresight, and an unspoken relationship with the stars, a site now known as Archaim. From ground level, Archaim appears modest, almost unimpressive, with low earthen ridges and shallow trenches stretching across a quiet steppe landscape. Yet from the air its full design becomes unmistakable as two perfectly concentric circles joined by radial walls and entrance corridors, forming one of the most geometrically exact ancient cities ever discovered in Eurasia. Archaim was constructed around 2000 BCE during the Middle Bronze Age by a culture now linked to the Sintashta tradition, a society of metallurgists, chariot builders, and pastoral warriors who occupied the vast steppes between Eastern Europe and Central Asia long before written records reached this region. This was not a random settlement that grew naturally over time, but a purpose-built city planned in advance, with every street, wall, dwelling, and channel positioned according to a predetermined geometric scheme that regulated movement, defence, drainage, and social organisation. The city consisted of two massive defensive rings made of timber-reinforced earth and clay, with the outer wall measuring roughly 160 metres in diameter and the inner ring enclosing a second protected zone, while between these walls ran a circular street paved with clay and stone that allowed defenders to move rapidly around the perimeter. Inside the inner ring stood a dense cluster of rectangular dwellings arranged like spokes around a central open plaza, each house sharing common walls with its neighbour and following the same architectural standard, which indicates that no individual household dominated the city and that community planning overrode private status. Each dwelling contained a hearth, metalworking furnaces, storage pits, ventilation shafts, and drainage channels that fed into a citywide system designed to remove waste and control water flow, demonstrating that Archaim was not only militarily defensive but technologically sophisticated in its internal engineering. The presence of highly developed bronze smelting furnaces inside residential buildings reveals that metal production was not isolated to workshops but integrated directly into domestic life, suggesting a society where craftsmanship, warfare, and daily survival were inseparable. The entire city was surrounded by a wide ditch that added another layer of defence while also functioning as a drainage and fire prevention system, meaning that every aspect of Archaim's layout was shaped by deliberate planning rather than spontaneous growth. What makes Archaim especially unusual among ancient fortified cities is not only its circular form but its precise orientation, because the main entrances, radial streets, and wall alignments correspond with specific solar and stellar positions throughout the year. Archaim is aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy, and its entrances correspond with the rising and setting positions of the sun at solstices and equinoxes, while certain internal sight lines appear to align with the movement of key constellations visible in the Bronze Age sky. This has led researchers to describe Archaim not only as a city, but as a functional astronomical observatory encoded into urban design, where the movement of people through daily life was synchronized with the movement of celestial bodies above them. Daily routines inside Archaim would have unfolded in an environment where sunrise, shadow length, and stellar cycles formed part of lived experience rather than abstract observation, shaping seasonal activity, ritual timing, and social order. The geographic position of Archaim places it within a larger cluster of similar circular fortresses known collectively as the Country of Towns, a network of more than 20 comparable settlements scattered across the southern Urals, all following similar geometric planning principles, defensive design, and astronomical orientation. This suggests that Archaim was not an isolated experiment, but part of a regional urban tradition shared by multiple communities linked through culture, trade, metallurgical knowledge, and military organisation. The people who built Archaim were among the earliest known chariot builders in human history, and fragments of chariot wheels, harness fittings, and horse remains discovered at related sites indicate that this region played a critical role in the early development of fast-wheeled warfare. This technological shift would later transform conflict across Eurasia, reshaping the power structures of entire civilizations from the Near East to India and beyond, meaning that Archaeum sits at the threshold of a military revolution that would alter the ancient world. Despite its sophistication, the city was only occupied for a relatively brief period of time, likely no more than a few centuries, after which it was deliberately abandoned and burned by its own inhabitants. There is no evidence of invasion, no signs of siege damage, and no indications of sudden catastrophe caused by enemies or natural disaster. Yet, nearly every structure within Archaeum shows clear traces of controlled fire. This suggests that the population intentionally dismantled their city through ritualized burning before leaving the site behind, a practice that remains one of the most enigmatic aspects of Archaeum's history. Why a society would invest enormous effort into building such a precisely planned city only to destroy it by choice remains unknown, but many scholars believe the act of burning may have held deep spiritual or symbolic meaning connected to cycles of renewal, migration, or cosmological belief. After its abandonment, the ruins of Archaeum slowly collapsed back into the steppe under wind-blown soil and seasonal flooding, leaving behind only faint circular ridges that blended almost perfectly into the surrounding terrain. For more than 3,000 years, the steppe swallowed its geometry, and the memory of its builders vanished into prehistoric silence. Archaeum's rediscovery came only at the end of the 20th century during a Soviet-era reservoir construction project that threatened to flood the entire valley before the circular anomaly was detected through aerial surveys. Emergency archaeological work revealed the full extent of the site just in time to halt the flooding plan, saving one of the most important Bronze Age discoveries ever made in northern Eurasia. Almost overnight, Archaeum transformed from an unknown outline in a field into one of the most studied prehistoric cities on the Eurasian steppe. Since its excavation, Archaeum has occupied a unique position not just in archaeology, but in public imagination, because its combination of circular geometry, astronomical alignment, chariot culture, and ritual destruction has made it a symbol of a lost scientific and spiritual tradition that existed long before classical civilizations recorded by history. While some speculative interpretations attempt to assign mythical origins to the city, the true power of Archaeum lies not in fantasy but in its very real demonstration that urban planning, metallurgy, astronomy, and military innovation coexisted in a single integrated society nearly 4,000 years ago. Standing at the centre of Archaeum today, surrounded by the faint rings of what was once a thriving fortified city, it becomes clear that this place was not built to display wealth, but to enforce balance between defence, production, movement, and celestial order. The mountain ring city of Archaeum reminds us that long before empires wrote their names in stone, entire communities were already shaping cities as instruments of science, survival, and cosmic alignment woven into everyday life. In the silence of the southern Ural steppe, the rings of Archaeum still trace a vanished understanding of time, space, and human order that once turned open grassland into a living calendar and a circular fortress at the same time. The Ice Age Tower of Jericho, Israel. In the deep Jordan Valley of what is now Israel, far below modern sea level and surrounded by arid desert hills, there exists a place where human beings first tested what it meant to live permanently in one location, to shape stone not just for tools, but for architecture, and to build something that outlived generations, a place known as Jericho, widely considered the oldest continuously occupied settlement on Earth. Within this ancient mound, at a site called Tel es-Sultan, archaeologists uncovered a structure so unexpected for its extreme age that it forced a complete rethinking of early human engineering. A massive freestanding stone tower built more than 11,000 years ago during the final phase of the last ice age. This structure, now called the Tower of Jericho, rises over 8 metres high and is built from large undressed limestone blocks stacked in circular form with careful internal engineering, and inside the tower is a stone staircase containing more than 20 steep steps that spiral upward through its hollow core. When this tower was first excavated in the 20th century, its age placed it thousands of years before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge, before metalworking, and even before pottery was widely used, at a time when most of humanity was still organised into mobile hunter-gatherer groups. Yet here stood a permanent stone monument, built by a community that had just begun the long transition from Ice Age survival to settled village life. The people who built this tower belonged to what archaeologists called a pre-pottery Neolithic culture, one of the earliest known farming societies in human history, living at a moment when wild wheat and barley were being domesticated, when animals were first controlled for food, and when seasonal movement was slowly being replaced by permanent residence. Jericho existed at a critical environmental crossroads because it stood beside natural freshwater springs in one of the driest regions of the Levant, making it a magnet for early settlement long before cities existed anywhere else. The earliest village of Jericho consisted of modest round houses built from mud brick, clustered tightly together on raised ground near these springs, and around this village the inhabitants constructed something that no other community on earth at that time had ever attempted on this scale: a massive stone wall and a towering circular stone structure rising above it. The wall itself measured over 3 metres high and surrounded the settlement entirely, while the tower rose from inside the wall and was integrated directly into the defensive or ceremonial landscape of the village. This combination of wall and tower makes Jericho the oldest known fortification system in human history. For many years, archaeologists debated the purpose of the tower because its construction seemed far too ambitious for a community that had only recently adopted agriculture and had no known military enemies demanding such heavy fortification. Some early interpretations suggested that the wall and tower were built to protect the village from seasonal flooding caused by sudden runoff from nearby hills, while others proposed that the tower served as a watchtower for defence, allowing inhabitants to spot approaching strangers across the open valley. More recent research, however, suggests a deeper and more symbolic function. The staircase within the tower faces west toward the hills where the sun sets at the summer solstice, and at that precise moment of the year the setting sun aligns visually with the top of the tower when viewed from the village below, which implies that this structure was carefully positioned to mark a key seasonal event in the solar calendar. If this interpretation is correct, then the Tower of Jericho was not just a defence mechanism or flood barrier, but one of the earliest known examples of monumental architecture built to organise human life around astronomical observation. The builders of the tower were encoding time into stone at a moment when time itself was becoming socially important, because farming depends not on wandering movement, but on seasonal precision. This shift from roaming survival to planned cultivation required tracking rainfall cycles, planting periods, and harvest windows, and the Tower of Jericho may represent humanity's first known attempt to anchor those cycles in a permanent architectural form. Inside the tower, the staircase is steep, dark, and enclosed, demanding effort and intention to climb, and at the top, a small platform once open to the sky, offering a vantage point over the surrounding Jericho plain and the western mountains beyond. From that height, early inhabitants would have watched the sun sink behind the hills at solstice, marking the turning of the agricultural year in stone long before formal calendars existed. The tower was built with remarkable structural intelligence considering its age. The interior staircase supports the outer walls. The stone blocks were laid with inward tapering that increases stability. The base was set into bedrock to anchor weight. This is not crude stacking, this is deliberate engineering. What makes this even more astonishing is that the people of Jericho had no metal tools, no wheel, no draft animals, and no written plans. Everything was accomplished with stone tools, human labour, shared planning, and generational memory. This means the Tower of Jericho is not simply an old building, it is the earliest proof that large groups of humans could coordinate labour, plan long-term projects, and sustain collective effort across years for purposes that went beyond immediate survival. Around the tower, archaeologists also discovered one of the most haunting ritual practices of the early Neolithic world, the creation of plastered human skulls, where the faces of the dead were reconstructed with clay and shells for eyes, preserving the identities of ancestors in lifelike form. These skulls were likely used in rituals connected to lineage, memory, and spiritual continuity, which suggests that Jericho's community saw their settlement not merely as shelter, but as a living bond between past, present, and future. The tower must be understood in this same ritual and symbolic context. It was not simply a practical structure, it was part of a worldview in which architecture, astronomy, agriculture, death, and memory were becoming inseparable. At some point after centuries of use, the tower was intentionally sealed. The entrance was blocked, the staircase was buried, the tower disappeared beneath layers of soil and debris as the village rebuilt itself multiple times above the original settlement. Over thousands of years, Jericho rose and fell as successive civilizations occupied the mound, from early farmers to Bronze Age kings, from biblical city to Roman outpost, from Islamic town to modern settlement. Each new culture built over the last, and beneath them all, the Ice Age tower slept beneath the earth. When archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho in the 1950s, using modern stratigraphic methods, it became clear just how deep this history ran, and when the tower emerged from the layers, it shattered every previous assumption about when monumental stone construction began. The Tower of Jericho pushed the origin of large-scale stone architecture back by thousands of years. It revealed that humans were capable of organised monumental thinking almost as soon as they began to settle down. Today the tower stands partially reconstructed within the Jericho Archaeological Park, no longer buried but still surrounded by the silence of deep time, its stone steps worn but visible, its form still intact despite surviving earthquakes, floods, abandonment, and millennia of human rebuilding above it. The Ice Age Tower of Jericho is not impressive because it is tall. It is impressive because it exists at all. It should not exist, according to what was once believed about early human civilization. Yet it does. It stands as proof that the human instinct to build for the future did not begin with kings, empires, or writing, but with small communities who chose to place their understanding of time, survival, and identity into permanent stone long before history learned how to record their names. The stone megacity of Caral, Peru, on the dry coastal plains of what is now Peru, far above the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean and deep within the narrow river corridor of the Supi Valley, there exists a stone city so old and so unexpected that its discovery forced historians to rewrite the opening chapter of civilization in the Americas, a place known today as Caral, the heart of what is now called the Norte Chico, or Caral Super civilization. Caral is not a village, and it is not a ceremonial ruin left behind by scattered tribes, but a fully developed urban centre built more than 5,000 years ago, making it older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia, and older than most of the ancient civilizations traditionally taught in history books. For thousands of years, Caral remained hidden in plain sight as a cluster of low stone mounds scattered across the desert valley floor, so eroded and silent that no one suspected they concealed the earliest known civilization of the entire American continent. It was only in the late 20th century, through systematic excavation led by Peruvian archaeologists, that these unassuming hills began to reveal enormous stepped platforms, sunken plazas, residential quarters, and ceremonial stairways emerging layer by layer from beneath wind-blown sand. What slowly emerged was not a single temple, but a planned city with at least 6 major pyramid platforms, broad open plazas, residential neighbourhoods, workshops, staircases, and ceremonial courts, all arranged according to a deliberate urban design that governed movement, ritual, and authority. The largest pyramid at Caral rises nearly 30 metres high and dominates the valley skyline, its immense stone terraces climbing upward through wide staircases and sloping ramps, a scale of construction that required sustained labour by a large organised population over many generations. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that Caral was thriving between roughly 3000 and 1800 BCE, a time when Egypt was only beginning to experiment with pyramid construction, and when Mesopotamia was still forming its earliest city-states, meaning that civilization emerged independently in Peru without influence from the old world. What makes Caral even more remarkable is not only its age, but the absence of many elements traditionally associated with early civilizations, because here there is no evidence of warfare, no fortification walls, no weapons, no mass graves of conflict, and no iconography glorifying conquest or kingship. Instead, Caral appears to have been built and sustained through cooperation, ritual coordination, trade, and shared ideology rather than military domination. The economy of Caral was rooted in a sophisticated balance between coastal marine resources and inland agricultural production, with fish, shellfish, and sea mammals coming from the Pacific shore, while cotton, squash, beans, and other crops were cultivated in irrigated fields along the Supa River. Cotton grown at Caral was used not only for clothing, but for making fishing nets, which were then traded to coastal communities in exchange for large quantities of dried fish, creating a mutually dependent economic system that linked desert farmers to maritime harvesters. This trade network stretched far beyond the Supa Valley, with materials such as spondylus shell, exotic stones, and plant products arriving from distant regions, proving that Caral was part of a broad interregional exchange system that connected diverse ecological zones long before the rise of empires. Caral had no writing system as far as archaeologists can determine, and it left behind no carved stone texts, no royal inscriptions, and no named rulers, yet it shows unmistakable signs of centralised planning and hierarchical organisation expressed through architecture rather than words. The pyramids of Caral were not tombs but ceremonial platforms that supported ritual structures made from perishable materials such as wood and reeds, indicating that public ceremony, music, and performance were central to social life. Inside and around these platforms, archaeologists have found musical instruments made from pelican and condor bones, including flutes and cornets, suggesting that sound and ritual performance played a key role in uniting large groups of people during public gatherings. At the heart of several complexes lie sunken circular plazas, carefully built with stone walls that descend below ground level, creating acoustically powerful spaces where voices and music would resonate dramatically during ceremonies, reinforcing collective identity through shared sensory experience. These circular plazas required complex engineering, with drainage systems to prevent flooding during seasonal rains and carefully fitted stonework to support surrounding terraces. Yet they were built long before metal tools or wheeled transport existed in the region. The political organisation of Corral appears to have been based on religious authority rather than military force, with elite residences located near major ceremonial platforms and ordinary dwellings spread outward across the city, forming a spatial hierarchy tied to ritual power. Unlike later Andean civilizations that emphasized warrior imagery and imperial expansion, Carral's symbolic language appears to have focused on cosmic order, fertility, water cycles, wind, and mountains, forces that shaped survival in an extreme desert environment. Evidence from plant remains and irrigation features shows that Carral's inhabitants controlled water flow through simple channel systems that diverted seasonal floods into agricultural fields, transforming barren desert into productive farmland capable of sustaining thousands of people. Yet despite this mastery of water and stone, Carral left behind almost no pottery, which is one of the most unusual aspects of the site, because pottery is a nearly universal marker of settled life in most early civilizations. The near absence of ceramics suggests that Carral's society developed along a distinct technological path where woven baskets, gourds, and organic containers served most domestic functions, proving that urban life did not require pottery as an early foundation. The decline of Corral appears to have been driven not by invasion or internal collapse, but by long-term climate instability, including powerful El Niño events that brought catastrophic flooding followed by severe drought, destabilizing agriculture and undermining the delicate balance between river irrigation and coastal fishing. Over time, the population gradually dispersed into smaller valley communities or migrated to more stable regions, carrying with them elements of Corral's architectural knowledge, ritual practices, and economic systems that later shaped other Andean cultures. For nearly 4,000 years after its abandonment, Corral stood silent beneath the desert wind, its pyramids softened into hills, its plazas filled with drifting sand, its role in human history entirely forgotten. There were no colonial chronicles that described it, no legends preserved among local communities that spoke of its former glory, and no surface monuments that demanded attention from travellers or scholars. It was archaeology alone that brought Corral back into the historical record, revealing not only an ancient city but a missing chapter in the story of civilization itself. Corral proves that complex urban life arose independently in the Americas without kings, without writing, without metal tools, and without organised warfare, driven instead by shared ritual, environmental adaptation, economic interdependence, and long-term planning. Standing among the exposed stone platforms today, with the Suit Valley stretching quiet and dry beyond the ruins, it becomes clear that this place was not built for conquest, spectacle, or imperial memory, but for coordination, ceremony, and survival within one of the harshest environments on Earth. The stone megacity of Corral does not confront us with towering statues or carved royal names, but with something far more rare in ancient history, which is the proof that civilization can rise through cooperation rather than domination. 5,000 years ago, in a narrow desert valley in Peru, human beings built a city that changed the fate of an entire continent without leaving behind a single written word to describe it. And yet, the stone still speaks. The black lava megaliths of Harat Khaibar, Saudi Arabia. Across the volcanic highlands of western Saudi Arabia, where black basalt flows stretch for hundreds of kilometres and not a single tree breaks the horizon, lies one of the least understood prehistoric landscapes on Earth, a place where tens of thousands of ancient stone structures sit, scattered across hardened lava like frozen echoes of a forgotten human world, a region known as Harat Khaibar. From the ground, this land feels empty, silent and hostile to long-term survival, with jagged rock underfoot, no rivers on the surface, and summer heat that can overwhelm the human body within hours. Yet from the sky, the desert suddenly reveals itself as a vast patterned canvas marked by circles, lines, triangles, corridors, and enclosures built entirely from stone and laid out across the lava with deliberate mathematical order. These are not natural formations, they are human constructions. Archaeologists, and aerial researchers have identified thousands of structures across Harat Kebar and adjacent lava fields, including long hunting traps called desert kites, circular and radial enclosures known as wheels, rectangular tomb platforms, tail-shaped keyhole monuments, and stone corridors that stretch for kilometres across open basalt. Most of these structures are visible only from the air. At ground level, they often appear as nothing more than slightly raised stone lines blending into the black volcanic surface, which is why they remain largely undocumented for most of modern history, despite covering one of the largest continuous archaeological landscapes on the planet. Harat Kebar itself is part of a massive volcanic province created by ancient eruptions that poured molten basalt across western Arabia over millions of years, leaving behind fields of hardened lava, volcanic cones, and crater ridges that stretch from northern Saudi Arabia deep into the Hijaz Mountains. For a long time it was assumed that such landscapes would have been avoided by early humans due to the lack of surface water and extreme conditions, but the stone structures of Harat Kebar tell a completely different story. They reveal that humans not only crossed these lava deserts, but settled, hunted, buried their dead, and organised mass cooperative labour here on a scale that challenges everything previously assumed about prehistoric Arabia. Many of the oldest structures in Harat Kebar date back more than 7,000 years, to a period when Arabia was far wetter than it is today, when grasslands covered much of the peninsula and seasonal lakes filled volcanic depressions, creating corridors of life through what is now desert. It was during this green phase of Arabia that early pastoral societies moved into these lava plains with herds of cattle, sheep, and goats, following rainfall patterns and building stone features that reshaped the landscape for both survival and ritual. One of the most striking features of Harat Kebar are the massive desert kites, enormous V-shaped or funnel-shaped stone walls that converge toward narrow enclosures, built to guide herds of wild animals into confinement, where they could be captured or slaughtered in large numbers. Some of these kites stretch for several kilometres, with walls carefully aligned to natural animal movement routes and landscape slopes, revealing a deep understanding of animal behaviour, terrain navigation, and cooperative hunting strategy. These structures required not one or two families, but entire communities acting together to plan, build, and operate, which means that social organisation in prehistoric Arabia was already highly developed thousands of years before written history appears in the region. Near these hunting systems are vast numbers of circular stone structures known as wheels, many of them featuring spokes radiating from a central point, their exact purpose still debated among archaeologists. Some appear to be ceremonial enclosures, others burial markers, and some may have served as territorial markers or seasonal gathering spaces, yet their sheer number and consistency of form across enormous distances suggest a shared symbolic language that spread across multiple prehistoric cultures of Arabia. Scattered among the wheels are thousands of stone burial structures built in distinctive shapes known as keyhole tombs, characterised by circular chambers connected to long stone tails, many of them aligned to specific directional patterns that may relate to solar movement or ancestral pathways across the lava. Excavations of some of these tombs have revealed human remains accompanied by simple grave goods, indicating that Harat Kebar was not only a place of hunting and movement, but also a sacred landscape where the dead were intentionally returned to the black stone fields. The construction of these monuments in basalt posed extraordinary challenges because volcanic rock is extremely hard, difficult to shape, and brutally heavy, meaning every wall and enclosure represents immense physical labour carried out with stone tools alone. This tells us that the builders valued these structures so deeply that they willingly invested enormous effort into shaping one of the harshest natural materials available, transforming raw lava into cultural architecture. One of the greatest mysteries of Harat Kebar is that many of its most complex features can only be fully understood from an aerial perspective, including long linear alignments that form geometric relationships impossible to perceive from the ground. Some stone rows run in straight lines for kilometres without deviation, crossing lava ridges and shallow craters as if guided by invisible surveying principles that predate any known measurement instruments in the region. The true scale of this landscape only became clear in the early 21st century with the use of satellite imagery and aerial photography, which suddenly revealed that what appeared to be isolated stone features were in fact part of a continent-scale network of prehistoric engineering. What once looked like scattered ruins became a single connected system of ancient land use extending from northern Arabia to the edges of the Red Sea. Unlike the great stone cities of Egypt or Mesopotamia, Harat Kebar does not present walls, temples, or palaces rising toward the sky, but instead spreads its architecture flat across the land, embedding human intention into the earth itself rather than lifting it into monuments. This horizontal architecture suggests a worldview where landscape itself was sacred, where movement across land, migration routes, hunting corridors, and burial pathways were all considered part of a larger cosmological order tied to survival and memory rather than centralized political power. As Arabia slowly dried after 5000 BCE due to shifting climate patterns, lakes vanished, grasslands retreated, and the human populations that had once thrived across Harat Kebar were forced to move toward more permanent water sources along the coasts and oases. Over centuries, the lava desert returned to near complete silence. The stone structures remained, blacked by wind and heat, unmoved by time. For thousands of years caravans passed nearby, without fully understanding what these low stone forms represented, and local oral traditions preserved only faint echoes of ancient peoples who once lived where now only rock remains. Unlike pyramids or temples, Harat Kebar never attracted grand restoration, imperial reuse, or religious repurposing, which is why so much of it remains untouched by later history. It was too spread out to conquer, too low to impress, too vast to erase. Modern archaeology now understands Harat Kebar as one of the most extensive prehistoric cultural landscapes on Earth, a place where thousands of independent stone features together form a single human story told across open lava rather than through written texts. It shows us that early people in Arabia were not merely wandering nomads, but landscape engineers capable of reshaping entire regions through coordinated collective action guided by environmental knowledge and symbolic meaning. The black lava megaliths of Harat Kebar challenged the idea that civilization must rise in river valleys or under the shadow of monumental cities, because here civilization expressed itself not in vertical stone temples, but in kilometre-wide networks of hunting systems, burial lines, and ceremonial geometry etched into lava. Today, standing on the edge of one of these ancient wheels with nothing but volcanic rock in every direction, and no visible sign of modern life on the horizon, it becomes clear that this place was never meant to be read through buildings alone. It was meant to be read through movement, through hunting, through death, through seasonal return. The people who shaped Harat Kebar understood the land at a scale we rarely consider today, and although their names are lost and their languages vanished, their stone intentions still bind the Black Desert together into one of the largest archaeological monuments ever created by human hands. The high-altitude capital of Chachapoyas, Peru, along the far northeastern edge of the Andean world, where the mountains dissolve into cloud forest and the air remains heavy with mist for most of the year, there once rose a network of stone cities built not in valleys or open plains, but along narrow vertical ridges high above the jungle canopy, a civilization that mastered the art of living on the edge of the sky. Known today as the Chachapoyas, whose highest strongholds still cling to stone spines of the eastern Andes in what is now northern Peru. The most famous of these ridge cities is Cuelap, a colossal stone enclosure built at an altitude of over 3,000 metres above sea level, wrapped in thousands of individual limestone blocks and perched on a knife-edge ridge that drops sharply into dense green forest on all sides, creating a city that appears less constructed than anchored into the mountain itself. Cuelap is often compared to Machu Picchu, but in many ways it is older, larger, in enclosed volume, and far more isolated, because unlike the polished imperial facilities of the Inca, Cuelap is built with raw, defensive intention, its outer retaining walls rising in some sections over 20 metres high and stretching for hundreds of metres along the ridge, sealing off the inner plateau completely from direct assault. The only access points into the city were 3 narrow ascending stone corridors that tighten gradually as they climb, reducing invaders to single-file vulnerability where even a handful of defenders could halt an advancing force with stones, spears, or boiling water, showing that the city was not built for ceremony first, but for survival above all else. Inside the fortress lies a sprawling urban landscape of more than 400 circular stone structures arranged along the ridgetop, each built with thick limestone walls and elevated bases, forming residential compounds, storage spaces, ceremonial buildings, and watch points arranged with careful spacing that allowed families to live, work, and defend within a fully enclosed mountain city. Unlike the rectangular planning typical of Inca cities, Chachapoyas' architecture favoured circular forms, a design that provided greater stability against earthquakes, distributed wall stress evenly, and created internal spaces better suited to the cool, wet conditions of the cloud forest environment. The Chachapoyas were not lowland jungle dwellers, and they were not high plateau Andeans either, but but a culture uniquely adapted to the vertical transition zone between mountains and rainforest, where agriculture required both terracing for altitude crops and intense drainage control to survive constant moisture. Archaeological evidence shows that they cultivated maize, potatoes, quinoa, and tubers on narrow stepped platforms cut into forested slopes, while also hunting within the dense cloud forest and maintaining long-distance trade routes that connected them to both Amazonian and Andean exchange networks. This hybrid environment shaped every part of their society, including their burial practices, which involved placing the dead inside vertical cliff tombs known as sarcophagi and inside communal burial chambers carved into overhanging rock walls high above the forest floor, making the cliffs themselves part of the social geography of life and death. These cliff burials, often painted in white and red and shaped like upright human figures, stare outward across the valleys in silent formation, reinforcing the idea that for the Chachapoyas, elevation meant protection not only for the living, but also for the dead. Spanish chroniclers later described the Chachapoyas as unusually tall and light-skinned for Andean populations, a description that likely reflects local genetic variation rather than mystery, yet it reinforced the sense among outsiders that this was a people apart, living in an isolated vertical world above the jungle. Before the arrival of the Inca, the Chachapoyas were organised into multiple regional centres rather than a single unified empire, with Cuelap likely functioning as a high-altitude capital, ceremonial hub, and last resort fortress for surrounding settlements scattered across ridges and valleys. The city was built not in one generation, but across centuries, with outer walls raised, internal neighbourhoods expanded, and terraces reshaped as population increased and defence needs evolved, meaning Cuelap represents an accumulation of survival strategy rather than a single architectural vision imposed from above. When the Inca Empire expanded northward in the 15th century, they encountered fierce resistance from the Chachapoyas, who knew their terrain intimately and defended narrow ridge routes where imperial armies could not deploy their usual large-scale formations. Eventually, through a combination of military pressure, political negotiation, and strategic marriage alliances, the Incas absorbed the Chachapoyas into their expanding territory, but even after conquest, the region remained volatile, with repeated uprisings and shifting loyalties. Inca administrators built their own settlements near Chachapoyas territory and resettled populations to reduce resistance, but Cuelap itself appears to have been largely abandoned before the full consolidation of Inca control, suggesting that the fortress had already fulfilled its role as a defensive city rather than an ongoing administrative centre. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the Chachapoyas allied with them against Inca authority, hoping the foreign newcomers might free them from imperial control, a decision that ultimately led not to independence, but to disease, forced relocation, and cultural collapse. European epidemics swept through the cloud forest with devastating speed, wiping out vast portions of the population within a few generations, and without large surviving communities to maintain ridge cities like Cuelap, the jungle and cloud mist slowly reclaimed the stone. For centuries after the collapse, Cuelap remained hidden beneath dense vegetation, known only through local memory as a place of old walls on the mountain, too remote and difficult to reach to attract early colonial settlement or large-scale exploitation. It was not until the 19th century that explorers began to record the site systematically, climbing through forested slopes and emerging suddenly onto a fully enclosed stone city suspended above the clouds, a moment that revealed to the outside world that a major Andean civilization had existed far outside the traditional Inca heartland. Archaeological excavation has since revealed complex internal zoning within Cuelap, with areas dedicated to elite residences, ceremonial platforms, storage complexes, and communal living quarters, indicating a structured social hierarchy embedded directly into the urban layout. One of the most distinctive features within the city is a group of tower-like ceremonial buildings rising above the circular dwellings, likely used for ritual observation, signal communication, or elite authority performances that reinforce leadership through visibility. Water management inside Cuelap was achieved through hidden stone drainage systems built beneath floors and terraces that diverted constant rainfall away from living spaces and prevented structural collapse in a climate where unchecked water could destroy stone foundations within decades. The fact that Cuelap still stands today after centuries of abandonment is itself proof of the extraordinary engineering skill of its builders, who understood how to anchor massive stone walls into unstable ridge bedrock while channeling water through gravity-controlled systems adapted to one of the wettest environments in the Andes. The high-altitude capital of Chachapoyas was not built for spectacle, empire, or long-distance diplomacy, but for endurance in a hostile vertical world where defence, drainage, and visibility were more important than monumentality. From the ridge of Quail up today, the cloud forest stretches in endless layers below, obscuring valleys, rivers, and pathways, and it becomes easy to understand why this civilization chose the sky as its ground, not because it sought isolation, but because height itself was the only reliable shield against invasion, climate, and disappearance. Unlike imperial capitals that rise in fertile basins, Kuilat rises where supply is difficult, movement is dangerous, and visibility is absolute, a city shaped not by abundance, but by the constant management of risk. The Chachapoyas did not leave behind gold statues, written records, or royal lineages carved in stone, but they left behind something equally powerful, which is a city that proves human societies can flourish in environments that appear at first glance completely unsuited for urban life. The high-altitude capital of Chachapoyas stands today not as a key, polished monument of empire, but as a raw survival city carved into ridge and cloud, reminding us that some of the world's greatest civilizations were built not where life was easy, but where it demanded absolute mastery of terrain, weather, and collective defence. The rock labyrinth of Dara, Turkey. On the dry stone plains of southeastern Turkey, near the modern border with Syria, there lies a city that was never meant to be admired from afar, but rather to survive under constant threat. A fortress carved not only across the land, but deep into the rock below it. A place built at the very edge of two rival empires, where defence, water, and human endurance became inseparable. A place known as Dara. Dara was founded in the early 6th century CE during the reign of the Eastern Roman Emperor Anastasius III as a direct response to the growing power of the Sasanian Empire, whose frontier towns stood only a short distance across the open plains to the east. The site chosen for Dara was not naturally defensible like a mountain fortress, so the builders compensated by creating one of the most heavily engineered frontier cities of the entire Byzantine world. From the surface, Dara presented massive defensive walls, towers and gates built from dressed limestone blocks laid with precision, forming a rectangular defensive perimeter that sealed the city from attack. These walls were thick enough to absorb siege artillery, and their towers were arranged at carefully calculated intervals to provide overlapping fields of fire. But the true genius of Dara was never visible to approaching armies. The real city lived underground. Beneath the streets, beneath the fortifications, and beneath the homes, the builders carved an extensive subterranean world of tunnels, chambers, cisterns, storage vaults, flood control shafts, escape corridors, and prison cells directly into the limestone bedrock. This underground system turned Dara into a self-contained survival machine, capable of withstanding long sieges in one of the driest frontier zones of the ancient world. Water was the primary weakness of any desert fortress, and Dara faced this problem with monumental engineering rather than compromise. Instead of relying solely on surface wells, engineers diverted seasonal streams through a dam system outside the city and channeled that water into massive underground cisterns carved inside the rock beneath the streets. These cisterns were not simple pits. They were cathedral-sized vaulted chambers with stone arches, ventilation shafts and access stairways that descended deep underground, capable of storing enough water to sustain the entire population for months during siege conditions. Gravity-fed channels moved water silently through the rock, protected from evaporation and enemy sabotage. Even today, standing inside these cisterns feels less like entering a water tank and more like walking into a buried basilica, where stone pillars rise from darkness and the ceiling disappears into shadow above still water. The underground network extended beyond water storage. Long corridors connected strategic points beneath the city, allowing soldiers to move unseen between towers, gates, and internal defensive positions. Escape routes led beyond the walls to concealed external exits that could be used for surprise attacks or emergency withdrawals. One of the most chilling components of this underground world lies in the rock-cut prison complex, where tall vertical chambers were carved straight down into the stone, accessible only through small openings at the top. Prisoners were lowered by rope into darkness, with no visible exit and no light except what filtered down from above. These were not holding cells for short confinement. These were spaces meant to erase people from the surface world. The vertical depth of these prison shafts remains difficult to measure, precisely due to collapse and sediment, but their design alone reflects the psychological dimension of fortress life, where control of space itself became a tool of imperial authority. Above ground, Dara developed into a full frontier city with churches, markets, workshops, military barracks, and administrative buildings. Its population included Roman soldiers, engineers, merchants, clergy, craftsmen, and families who lived permanently under siege conditions, knowing that at any moment Persian armies could appear on the horizon. The city was repeatedly attacked during the long Byzantine-Sasanian wars. One of the most famous engagements was the Battle of Dara in 530 CE, where Byzantine forces under the general Belisarius defeated a larger Persian army using defensive formations and battlefield engineering that mirrored the city's own strategic design. Despite its defences, Dara eventually fell to the Persians in the 6th century after prolonged conflict, only to be recaptured later by the Byzantines, then lost again permanently during the early Islamic expansions of the 7th century. Each conquest altered the city's above-ground identity, but the rock beneath remained largely unchanged. As the political frontier shifted and military priorities moved elsewhere, Dara lost its strategic importance. Trade routes changed, garrisons were withdrawn, administrative centres relocated, the surface city slowly emptied, yet the underground world persisted in silence. Rainwater continued to descend into cisterns, tunnels collapsed slowly, sediment accumulated, the living city vanished, but the rock labyrinth remained intact beneath the soil. For more than 1,000 years, Dara faded into an agricultural settlement where farmers worked fields above buried prisons, dams, and war corridors without knowing the full extent of what lay beneath their feet. Its rediscovery in modern times revealed something rare in ancient urban history, which is a city whose most critical architecture was never meant to be seen in daylight. Unlike temples, theatres, or palaces designed to be displayed to society and posterity, Dara's most important structures were hidden by intention, engineered to function in darkness rather than in glory. This difference reshapes how we understand power in frontier cities, because here power was not expressed through monumental beauty but through total environmental control of water, movement, and confinement. Dara was a city designed to survive starvation, attack, thirst, disease, and internal disorder through engineering rather than symbolism. The rock labyrinth of Dara represents the extreme endpoint of ancient siege architecture, where the surface city was only the visible shell of a far more complex subterranean machine. Today, as archaeologists descend into these chambers with lighting and mapping tools, they walk through spaces that once trembled with prison voices, water flows, and military footsteps, yet now echo only with the sound of dripping stone and modern breath. The dams still hold portions of seasonal flow, the cisterns still collect water, the tunnels still lead through darkness in directions no one fully mapped for centuries. Dara did not fall in one dramatic moment of destruction. It slowly lost meaning as borders moved on and empires collapsed beyond it. Yet the city beneath the city remained preserved because no later power found reason to erase what could not be easily accessed. The rock labyrinth of Dara stands today as a reminder that some of the greatest achievements of ancient engineering were built not to be admired, but to be trusted in the worst moments of human history when survival depended entirely on what lay hidden beneath the stone.